Welcome to Broadband Action. It's a production of the Community Broadband Action Network. I'm Curtis Dean, and today I'm excited to be joined by Sean Stokes. Sean is with Keller and Heckman, law practice in Washington that has done a lot of work in the telecommunications space over the years. They are a strong supporter of CBAN, a broadband backer. Thank you for doing that, Sean. And today we're going to be talking about the recent change in political directions in the United States and what it's going to mean for broadband policy. There could be some big impacts, could be minor impacts. We really don't know at this point, but it is certainly a topic that is worth discussing. And it's also been something that a lot of industry pundits have been doing hot takes on here the past week or so, Sean. So I guess it's our turn for a hot take. So Thanks for coming on with me. I appreciate it.
Sure. Happy to be here.
Well, I want to start to what could potentially be the biggest impact, because it's a huge issue right now, and it's in mid-implementation. That is the BEAD program. Do we think that the new Trump administration will do anything to the BEAD program that will change how it's implemented, or maybe even claw that money back?
I'm going to take the second part of that question first. I don't believe that there's going to be a significant effort at a clawback on it. I think that we've gone too far with the allocation of this funding and spending of it to take it back at this point. The Infrastructure Act was broadly supported. It was bipartisan. And let's face it, the vast majority of this funds, by definition, for BEAD is going to underserved areas, which are in more rural areas, which also tend to be red states. So there's a strong benefit there. That said, there has been a lot of elbow throwing over the last 6 to 8 months about what are perceived either additional regulatory creep and slowing down of the process, and things that didn't necessarily need to be in there is the argument by a number of Republicans in particular. So I would think the administration would more want to take the view of what can we do to make the program more efficient. They would argue that would hew more to what the strict letter of what the Infrastructure Act said. And so anything that they felt that the current administration may have added on to it that wasn't necessarily included. So I'm thinking things like questions about the requirements for the low cost option, issues about a significant one presumably would be issues about the preference for the use of fiber, particularly when you start to look at the Starlink types of arguments for certain rural areas, and particularly if you're talking about a rural area that the state actually is not likely to have, as they look at it currently, sufficient funds even under BEAD to meet all of its goals, as opposed to some states like Texas, which they expect that they'll probably, if done correctly, have reserve funds to use for other types of things.
Right. And Colorado's another one, and maybe Michigan or other states that I'm aware of that think they might have some left over to use for other purposes.
So I think it'd be more like those ways, as opposed to take that money back.
So one question about that, I'm absolutely in agreement and thinking that low Earth orbit satellite, such as Musk's Starlink, Amazon's Kuiper project, may end up being part of the solution now, and that there might be some wavering of, I should say, the fiber first preference. But my curiosity in that is how this is the D is for deployment, and how do you subsidize something that's already, for the most part, fully deployed, unless a Musk or a Jeff Bezos could make the case that they need additional money for more satellites, more capacity, so that more people could utilize their services. Do you think that's the angle they'd have to take?
I would think it would have to be something along those lines, because you're right. This is absolutely a program aimed at capital costs and like you said, deployment. This is not the service. This is not the digital equity portion of it to make sure that that people know how to use it and affordable. And so there is a question about how how satellite fits into it. On the other hand, to the extent that we're also talking about fixed wireless, that certainly has deployment costs. The satellite one is also, it's an interesting question about timing. People think that satellite's going to be so quick, but the amount of time it might take to actually get the coverage in some of these areas, unless you have a ramped up satellite schedule in some ways, which I that would be an interesting, whether that all of that going to deployment costs. It could open up a lot of things that could add more time back into all of this.
True that. That's I'm a space fan, right? So I
Yeah,
follow all of the various platforms, including Musk, and he's banking a lot on finishing the Starlink constellation through the new Starship, and the Super Heavy booster, which has
right,
still only been flown 5 times and only
right,
once really successfully. So that probably has another year or two before it's fully enough that they can go up with their Pez dispenser and shoot these satellites out.
right.
And Kuiper, Amazon's product, is right now relying on launch capacity from its competitor, SpaceX, and from other launch services. So you're right. You can't just turn the spigot and suddenly shoot satellites up in orbit. They have to have the infrastructure, the rocket infrastructure to place it in orbit. So, how Musk or Bezos would argue that, well, we should get some of this money so we can speed up development of our Starship or our other craft. That could be some interesting discussions there.
It is. It's also an interesting discussion from, we've been having for past 2 years, it seems like, debate under the challenge process. And now the satellite part about it is what is considered served versus unserved. If you're gonna go that route, it creates some real practical questions and as well as philosophical. What are we actually talking about?
Yeah.
And there's also, I have questions, not from the paranoia point of view, but just questions about that. It seems to be putting a lot of eggs in one basket from a security and reliability, redundancy point of view, to have everything based in satellites. We already have concerns about the level of our security of things in space right now, being more vulnerable maybe than some other countries are, given how far we've already started to rely on some of that.
Well, if any of you are non-space fans out there, I just encourage you to look up the term Kessler effect or Kessler syndrome. And that is the theory whereby with so many satellites in orbit, a minor collision between two could cascade into creating a giant junk field that wipes out all the satellites.
Yeah.
So certainly that's something that, if Musk wants 10,000 and Amazon wants another 10,000, you've got other companies out there doing low Earth orbit too. Space is already pretty cluttered, and it wouldn't take much for a little traffic accident up there to pretty much send us back to I wouldn't say the Stone Ages, but imagine how we could live without GPS now in our lives. Well, let's pivot now to the FCC in general. This has been a Democratic-controlled FCC, a 3-2, and that has been the tradition forever and ever for the party in power in the White House to have its party have 3 commissioners and the other party have 2. Well, it will be at least a 3-2. But the question I have for you on that is, with a new president coming in that is challenging norms, might Trump be able to challenge the norm that it should be 3-2, or is there any statutory reason it would have to?
Well, you could put an independent in. There's any number of, pick your flavors. I think there are ways to get at that. But the fact is also, I think, given the the strong majority that he has in the Senate, his confirmation process is going to go so quickly that people that might otherwise, he can afford to lose, a vote or two in the Senate and still get his choices through. And 3-2 you might have more debate on it, but 3-2 carries the day just as easily as a larger majority. So I think he could do something different, but he could also just carry what he wants with a 3-2 and get it through quickly. I know they're also even talking about urging recess confirmation authority, all sorts of other types of things. I do think also the fact that they want to, that they're intending to hit the ground running on a number of issues, and to a certain extent, particularly Brendan Carr has already been, he would be he's the current FCC commissioner that would likely be at least the interim chair. He's been with the FCC for a number of years, including during the PI administration. So he's well versed in all the mechanics of it. And I think, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, he actually wrote a chapter in Project 25, sort of outlining his vision on these types of things. So it's pretty clear where he would want to go and hit the ground running on a number of these types of things.
Yeah.
Plus, you've got a supportive Congress now. It's a lot easier to try and, from an administrative agency, try and push agendas where you also think Congress is going to be in a line with you.
One thing that I think is interesting is to think about, of the 3 Democrats that are on now, which one's most likely to go? Rosenworcel, because she's been a pretty aggressive and progressive, if you want to say, member of the court and as leader, or will it be one of the other 2 Dems?
Yeah, it's an interesting point also of if you've been the chair and aggressive, to step down maybe at that point may make sense. On the other hand, you could see, I'm going to stay to fight the good fight. It's an interesting question from a term point of view. Rosenworcel's also been there the longest. I don't recall where their terms sync up in terms of their reappointments would be from the timing point of view. But it's an interesting question also about where they want to go and what they'd already been looking at doing, what they might do, because certainly that's always going to be in somebody's mind in DC about where you're going to go next, where you're going to land. There haven't been too many chairs that have stuck around much. There's interim chairs or people that were never confirmed that held the reins that stuck around, but there's not that many that stayed on. Quello did, and some others, but
yeah, back in the good old days, right? No,
yeah.
Just kidding. So a question on, let's talk about specific FCC policies.
Yeah.
And under the Rosenworcel Commission, some of the major initiatives that have been launched, let's talk a little bit about what the future of those will be, in our opinion, or your opinion. Net neutrality.
Yeah, so net neutrality was already under fire. They just had their oral argument before the Sixth Circuit about whether or not it will be legally upheld, particularly now that we've had the Supreme Court undo what Chevron deference, meaning preference for agency decision making that are reasonable. The Chevron deference going away. One of the things that the Supreme Court actually raised, even though it was not an FCC or telecom related case, in that case, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch specifically brought up net neutrality and the reclassification of broadband internet as one of these things that keeps flip-flopping back and forth. So I think the combination of the lack of Chevron deference and now having a new administration taking the reins, that either the courts will decide that it doesn't pass muster anymore, or the new coming in administration will unwind the practice. So I think that'll go away. I think similar issues are going to happen with the digital discrimination ruling. I mean, even though that was implemented pursuant to a statute, there's a lot of arguments that went further than what the statute said. So I think that, and again, that's one that's already in the courts. Similarly, I don't think that Chairman Rosenworcel's MDU bulk billing proposal, which never actually saw the light of day, I don't see
Yeah.
that coming out. I
I
think
don't know. That would have come out with a continued Biden administration. That just seemed to be like a real flyer that just was not getting enough
yeah, it's
support.
going to go anywhere. And
It was a
incidentally,
problem it was trying to solve a problem that exists only in very few instances.
right, and to a certain extent, maybe counterproductive even on certain types of consumer issues that you were trying to aim at, such as people on fixed incomes and
Hmm.
senior living and other types of things. But the other issue is, and I think you mentioned it earlier before we got on the call, was the fact that both the House and the Senate have basically directed the FCC pencils down on anything that's controversial. And, that sometimes gets headlines by press, but that is not, that's not an unusual statement. That happens
It's kind
almost
of
with
tradition,
change
isn't it?
administration. That is a traditional, that actually is a norm. For all
Yeah.
the norm discussion break-ins, that's sometimes I've seen some headlines that would make it sound like that's some clickbait type thing. It's like, no, that's pretty typical. But what does that mean for other types of issues? The How do you handle USF, a universal
Hmm.
service reform? Because that's again one of the ones that was already in the courts that had been struck by at least the Fifth Circuit. Some other courts have upheld it, but going to the Supreme Court. But now you're going to have a different Congress and a different FCC looking at their support for it. Brendan Carr has suggested, that it needs to be, all funding needs to be more targeted and more efficient. Senator Cruz, who'd likely be, could be potentially the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, has expressed interest over time for appropriations to handle USF and that it'll be more targeted. So I think there's a lot of issues like that could impact the FCC in ways that really for years had not changed under different administrations.
And of course, the USF is still under court attack right now. And can the new administration influence that at all?
Well, it's an interesting question about the way, if that, assuming that goes to the Supreme Court, which we fully expect it will, is if the Supreme Court agrees with the Fifth Circuit, could they still agree with them, but split how they address it? So because the Fifth Circuit found that the USF was unconstitutional on a couple of grounds, and basically said that we don't need to decide whether each one of these individually would be sufficient, but that in combination. And one of the things, though, in particular, was that I could see that the Supreme Court latching onto was the FCC improperly delegating authority to the Universal Service Administrative Company. I'm not saying that's my position on it, but I'm saying that I could see that, which would come back to an FCC to then reform and revise. So I think there'd be a role for the FCC there, as opposed to if the court just struck the whole issue, then I feel like you're back to Congress.
Right. That might be the best solution, as far as the solution that ends up maybe putting us in a better place. So we've all known that the Universal Service Fund is
it's broken. It's just
broken, very broken, and maybe the court will break it just enough that the policymakers have to finally fix it, which they neglected to do.
I mean, there's absolutely that. There's the other aspect of it too, that, at the same time all that's going on, you've got circulating the question of how, whether some big tech companies that use and rely on the internet should have to contribute to universal service. And I raise that only because before the call, again, I was reading through Commissioner Carr's piece in Project 25, and one of the things he said was they should have to pay into it. So it's an interesting set of processes, and USF has always been one of those fascinating issues, a little bit like BEAD, that the politics don't necessarily line up the way you expect them to, because a lot of the funding goes to areas that tend to be more rural areas and often, as I said, more conservative. And so those might be programs that might philosophically be something that people might be opposed to, but it's viewed as this is the only way to get cost-effective service out to these areas and provide essential capabilities. So, how do you address that in ways that are consistent with your overall philosophy on politics? It's fascinating the way that people sometimes have to tie themselves into knots to get there. And so we sometimes have these programs that really just don't make any sense.
It always sounds so easy in a 30-second commercial, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
And
does.
that's the politics, and then the governing part is where it gets pretty ugly, and sometimes there's just no good solutions. So that may be where we're going to be the next few months. One other quick topic before we have to go, I just wanted to bring up, Sean, broadband labels. Are those going to become a thing of the past too?
That's an interesting question because, you know, it was, I think it was mid-October, October 10th or so, that everybody, the smaller entities, were moved onto it. And there was not a lot of, you know, fanfare one way or the other. It's one of those things that I think once it's there and people are looking at it, it's kind of hard to unwind it, not from the point of physically being difficult, but why would you no longer do this? I think the issue is going to be the level of the granularity and the rules and how you're going to do it, or changes, or when you're going to offer promotional discount, all those types of things that, let's face it, actually are going to be headaches for the small guys too. So this is not a benefit to somebody that's, you know, a startup that you want to encourage, or a community or a public-private partnership that's doing these things. They're already intending to get that information out there and clearly label it and describe it, but to try and track, and you don't want it to turn into a regulatory gotcha.
Right. Well, the bottom line for me is, I've been thinking about this, really thought about this 4 years ago, is how the industry just suffers from regulatory whiplash, because every 4 to 8 years we have a complete pivot on policy and how it affects the people that deliver the services, the providers and others. So it's just another case of that. It's just now that the whiplash is going back the other direction. So I guess it's going to be something that everybody will have to be coping with.
I think that's right, and I think that's the same issue with even just the regulatory classification of broadband internet, is that there are some important policy objectives on both sides of the argument on it, but for the providers caught in the middle, it really, particularly small to mid-sized ones, it's, well, actually everybody, just some form of certainty, and then let's move forward.
Yes.
You know, wherever this lands, just keep it there and let's move forward.
Well, it seems that whenever there's been some policy initiative that has come through the, shall we say, more partisan political process, providers just end up having to roll their eyes because they know it's going to be undone at some point.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, and I can make this real quick because I know we're going to wrap, is part of it is also broadband in particular. It goes back to that we're talking about things that came out from everybody's working for the 1996 Telecom Act.
Right.
And when you had these stovepipe, you know, telecommunication service, cable service, wireless service, broadband, sort of, where does it fit into those? The same providers now providing all of those services, and yet they're treated differently for each one of those. And that's where a lot of these problems come from. You know, if you're classified as a broadband service, you don't get access to poles or rights of way. But if you're providing telecom service, you do. If you're providing VoIP, what is that? Those are the types of things where, you know, Congress actually has to, if you really have a problem with this, Congress actually has to solve this and address the current services, as opposed to trying to shoehorn in these services under prior or antiquated regulatory structures.
Well, let's sometime get a bunch of people smarter than me, like you and others, in a room, and let's rewrite the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and just solve this problem for the world. How about we do that?
Well, it's funny because it just 96. It's, you know, that's a pretty old act for something that's moving so quickly, and so many.
Really pre-public internet, right?
It is.
I mean, there was a net then, but it wasn't one that any of us were getting.
And certainly the concept of smartphones and all those other types of things, it's
AI,
well before that, you know. So it's remarkable that a policy, an area that is so policy and technology driven would be tied to a law that's from 1996.
And think about what was it, the original Radio Act of 1932, and that was the law, kind of the guiding point until 96. And it seems like a long gap, but we're getting close to that now. It will be in here in the next decade or so. So Well, hey, we can't solve all the problems in a 25-minute podcast, but Sean, it's really good to talk to you and get your perspective. This will be developing and unfolding over the next few months, and we'll be keeping track of it here at Broadband Action, and we'll turn to our great friends in the industry like Sean and Keller and Heckman to help us interpret what it's all about. So, Sean, thanks for coming on today.
Happy to do that. Happy to be here, and we'll see how wrong we were in 6 months.
Yeah, my crystal ball is always very fuzzy, so we'll see what happens.
All right.
All right, thank you, everybody. We appreciate you joining us here on this episode of Broadband Action. We'll see you next time.